Thomas Reed spent his evenings mopping the marble floors of the Whitmore Gallery, his worn canvas shoes squeaking softly against the polished stone as priceless paintings watched from gilded frames. During his brief breaks, he would sit in the dim break room and sketch quietly in a battered notebook, finding solace in the simple act of creation. When Victoria Ashford, the gallery's imperious director, discovered him drawing one evening, she laughed in his face and mocked his artistic pretensions in front of wealthy patrons and mortified staff members, calling him a delusional janitor who needed to know his place. She had no idea that the humble man in the maintenance uniform was actually Thomas J. Reed, the mysterious genius whose paintings sold for millions and whose true identity had remained hidden from the art world for 30 years. What happened next left everyone speechless. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Thomas Reed arrived at the Whitmore Gallery each evening at precisely 6 o'clock, just as the last visitors were ushered out and the heavy brass doors were locked behind them. He wore the same faded blue maintenance uniform every night, the fabric softened by countless washings and the knees permanently stained from years of scrubbing floors. His work boots were scuffed and worn, the leather creased with age, and he carried his supplies in a dented metal cart that squeaked slightly as he pushed it through the gallery's hushed corridors. At 53 years old, Thomas had the kind of face that people rarely noticed, gentle and weathered with lines that spoke of quiet contemplation rather than hardship. His graying hair was always neatly combed, and his hands, though calloused and rough from his work, moved with a surprising delicacy when he wiped down the glass display cases or carefully dusted the ornate frames. He approached his work with a reverence that the daytime staff found peculiar but harmless, taking care never to spray cleaning solution too close to the canvases and always pausing to admire each piece before moving on to the next. The Whitmore Gallery housed some of the finest art in the city, from Renaissance masterpieces to contemporary installations, and Thomas knew every painting, every sculpture, every carefully curated corner as intimately as he knew his own reflection. During his 30-minute break at 9 o'clock, Thomas would retreat to the small break room on the lower level, a cramped space with flickering fluorescent lights and a coffee maker that had seen better days. He would sit at the worn plastic table, pour himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from his dented thermos, and pull out his sketchbook, a simple spiral-bound notebook with a green cover that was beginning to curl at the edges. For those precious 30 minutes, the world fell away, and there was only the scratch of pencil on paper, the slow emergence of lines and shadows, the quiet joy of creation. He never drew from imagination, but from memory, recreating the paintings he had studied during his shift, or capturing the play of light through the gallery's tall windows. His small studio apartment 15 blocks away was much like him, simple and unassuming, with a single window overlooking a narrow alley, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, and a small table where he sometimes continued his sketches before sleep claimed him. This was his life, uncomplicated and peaceful, filled with beauty borrowed from gilded frames and quiet moments stolen between mop strokes. The Whitmore Gallery stood like a temple to refinement on the corner of 5th and Madison, its limestone facade gleaming white against the city skyline, and its tall windows offering tantalizing glimpses of the treasures within. For over 70 years, it had been the destination for collectors who measured their wealth in generations rather than years, for critics whose reviews could make or break an artist's career, and for socialites who understood that being seen at a Whitmore exhibition was as important as owning the art itself. The gallery's reputation was built on exclusivity and an almost supernatural ability to identify genius before the rest of the world caught on, launching unknown artists into stardom and commanding prices that made headlines in the financial papers. Victoria Ashford had been the director for 8 years, and in that time she had transformed the Whitmore from a respected institution into a cultural powerhouse that dominated the contemporary art scene. She was 42 years old and looked like she had been carved from expensive marble herself, with sharp cheekbones, perfectly styled blonde hair that never dared fall out of place, and a wardrobe of tailored designer suits that cost more than most people earned in months. Today she wore a charcoal gray suit with a silk blouse, the color of champagne, and her signature statement necklace, a chunky gold piece that an emerging sculptor had created especially for her. He caught the light as she moved through the gallery, with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Victoria prided herself on her eye for talent, on her ability to stand before a canvas and know within moments whether the artist had that indefinable quality that separated the memorable from the mundane. She spoke often at panel discussions about trusting one's instincts, about the importance of curation, about maintaining standards in an increasingly democratic art world where everyone with a paintbrush thought themselves the next great master. Her staff both admired and feared her, understanding that her praise was rare and her criticism swift, and the support staff, the security guards and maintenance workers and administrative assistants who kept the gallery running, existed in her peripheral vision as interchangeable figures whose names she rarely bothered to learn. The upcoming annual gala, scheduled for Friday evening, would be the crown jewel of the season. With 300 invited guests, a 7-figure budget, and the unveiling of a controversial new installation that had already generated buzz in all the right publications, Victoria had spent months planning every detail, and she intended for it to be flawless, a night that would cement her reputation as the most influential curator of her generation. Sarah Chen had been a junior curator at the Whitmore Gallery for 18 months, and she still felt like an imposter every time she walked through those brass doors. At 28, she was the youngest member of the curatorial team, fresh from her master's degree in art history and painfully aware of how much she still had to learn. She dressed carefully each morning in simple professional clothes that wouldn't draw too much attention, her long dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her jewelry minimal and understated, hoping that if she made herself small enough, she might avoid the cutting remarks that Victoria sometimes delivered like surgical strikes. Unlike her director, Sarah had not forgotten what it felt like to be overlooked, to have her opinions dismissed, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. She made it a point to learn the names of everyone who worked at the gallery, from the security guards who stood watch during the day to the maintenance staff who kept the building pristine. Thomas was the night janitor, and Sarah often stayed late working on exhibition catalogs or researching potential acquisitions. So, their paths crossed several times a week. She had noticed immediately that he was different from the other maintenance workers, that he moved through the galleries with a kind of reverence, pausing before certain paintings as though in conversation with them, his eyes studying brushstrokes and composition with an intensity that surprised her. One evening in early October, Sarah found Thomas in the contemporary wing, standing before a massive abstract expressionist canvas, his cleaning cart forgotten beside him. She approached quietly and stood beside him, following his gaze to the painting's violent swirls of crimson and black. After a long moment, Thomas spoke softly, commenting on how the artist had layered the paint to create depth, how the chaos on the surface revealed structure underneath if you looked long enough. Sarah smiled and agreed, adding her own observations, and they talked for nearly 10 minutes about technique and emotion, and the courage it took to create something raw and honest. When Thomas finally excused himself to continue his work, Sarah noticed the green sketchbook tucked into the side pocket of his cart, its cover worn and pages thick with use. She felt curious but said nothing, respecting his privacy the way she wished others would respect hers. As she watched him push his cart down the corridor, she thought that Thomas understood art better than half the collectors who walked through these doors, and she felt grateful that at least one person in this building saw beauty without needing to own it. Victoria had come down to the lower level looking for Martin, the head of security, to discuss placement of additional guards for the gala. And she was annoyed to find the security office empty. She stood in the fluorescent-lit hallway, her heels clicking impatiently against the linoleum floor, debating whether to wait or simply send an email, when she noticed the break room door was ajar and heard the faint sound of movement inside. She pushed the door open without knocking, already forming a sharp comment about staff taking unauthorized breaks, and found Thomas Reed sitting at the plastic table with a pencil in his hand, and his head bent over a notebook. Victoria stopped in the doorway, her eyes sweeping over the janitor in his faded uniform, the dented thermos, the shabby green notebook, and she felt a flicker of irritation at this intrusion of poverty into her carefully curated world. Thomas looked up at her arrival, his expression calm but guarded. And he set down his pencil with the slow, deliberate movement of someone trying not to startle a predator. Victoria meant to leave, to dismiss this scene as beneath her notice, but something made her pause. Perhaps it was the way Thomas had instinctively angled his body to shield the notebook from her view. Or perhaps it was simply that her curiosity, once triggered, demanded satisfaction. She took 3 steps into the room, her arms crossed over her chest, and asked in a tone that made it clear this was not really a question what he was doing. Thomas replied quietly that he was on his break and was just sketching. Nothing important. And he began to close the notebook. Victoria felt a surge of annoyance at this evasion, at the presumption that he could have secrets from her in her own gallery. And she moved closer to the table, her voice sharpening as she demanded to see what he was drawing. Thomas hesitated, his hand resting protectively on the notebook's cover, and for a moment Victoria thought he might actually refuse her. Then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he opened the notebook and turned it so she could see. The sketch was a landscape, a simple scene of rolling hills and a winding river, rendered in careful pencil strokes with attention to light and shadow. Victoria stared at it for a long moment, her face unreadable, while Thomas sat perfectly still and waited for her verdict. Victoria's laugh came suddenly, a short bark of amusement that seemed to surprise even her. And then she laughed again, longer this time, shaking her head as though she had just heard something absurd. She leaned closer to the notebook, her eyes scanning the landscape sketch with an expression that managed to be both dismissive and pitying. And when she finally looked up at Thomas, her smile was the kind that never reached her eyes. She asked if he was serious, if he actually spent his free time drawing pictures like a child with a coloring book, and her voice carried that particular tone that people use when they are being cruel but want to pretend they are being helpful. Thomas said nothing, his hands resting flat on the table, his face composed and unreadable. Victoria straightened up and crossed her arms, warming to her subject now, and she began to speak about hobby artists, about the epidemic of people who took a few community college classes or watched some videos online and suddenly believed they had talent. She said that the world was full of people who could not tell the difference between competent technical execution and genuine artistic vision, people who did not understand that being able to copy what you see was not the same as having something worth saying. Her voice took on a lecturing quality, as though she were explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. And she told Thomas that there was nothing wrong with having hobbies, nothing wrong with finding simple pleasures to fill empty hours, but that it was important to understand one's limitations and not confuse pleasant pastimes with serious artistic pursuit. Thomas met her gaze steadily, his expression calm and dignified, despite the color that had risen slightly in his cheeks. And he said quietly that he understood, that he drew simply because it brought him peace. Victoria made a soft sound of acknowledgement, dismissive and final, and then her expression shifted to something more stern as she reminded him that his break was 30 minutes, not longer, and that she expected the gallery floors to be spotless for the gala. She added, almost as an afterthought, that it would be best if he did not waste work time on fantasies, that he should focus on the job he was actually qualified to do. Then she turned on her heel and walked out of the break room without waiting for a response, leaving Thomas alone with his notebook and the lingering sting of her words. Victoria found that she could not stop thinking about the janitor and his little notebook, and the memory kept bubbling up at odd moments throughout the next day, bringing with it a mixture of amusement and something else she could not quite name. By Wednesday afternoon, she had mentioned it to 3 different people, each time framing it as a humorous anecdote about the delusions of ordinary people, about how everyone nowadays thought they were creative. She told the story to James, the senior curator, while they reviewed the gala seating chart, laughing about how she had discovered the janitor actually drawing pictures during his shift, as though he were some kind of undiscovered master. James had chuckled politely, though his smile did not quite reach his eyes, and he had quickly changed the subject back to the seating arrangements. That evening, Victoria was standing in the main gallery with 4 staff members, discussing the lighting for the new installation, when Thomas appeared with his cleaning cart, moving quietly along the perimeter of the room to empty the waste bins. Victoria paused mid-sentence, watching him. And then she smiled, and announced to the group that they should be careful what they said, because they were in the presence of an artist. Her tone made it clear that the word was meant as a joke. She proceeded to tell the story again, with more embellishment this time, describing the earnest little landscape drawing and the way Thomas had been so protective of his hobby, so serious about his sketches. The other staff members laughed, some more enthusiastically than others, their eyes darting nervously between Victoria and Thomas, uncertain of the appropriate response. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the group, her arms wrapped around her tablet, her face flushed with discomfort. But she said nothing, dropping her gaze to the floor instead. Thomas continued his work without pause, moving methodically from one waste bin to the next, his face expressionless and his movements steady. Victoria added that perhaps they should commission him to create something for the gala, perhaps a nice little landscape to hang in the bathroom, and the group laughed again, louder this time, emboldened by her continued amusement. Thomas finished his task, pushed his cart toward the door, and left the gallery without a word, his dignity intact even as their laughter followed him down the corridor. The staff meeting was held on Thursday afternoon in the gallery's conference room, a sleek space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city and a long glass table that reflected the faces of the 18 people gathered around it. Victoria stood at the head of the table, a presentation displayed on the screen behind her, outlining final preparations for the gala. And she moved through the agenda with her characteristic efficiency, discussing everything from coat check procedures to emergency protocols. The meeting was nearly finished when Victoria paused, set down her notes, and announced that she wanted to address something that had been on her mind, something about maintaining professional boundaries and understanding the culture of excellence that the Whitmore Gallery represented. Her voice took on a more serious tone, the kind she used when delivering what she believed to be important wisdom, and she began to speak about how everyone who worked at the gallery, regardless of their role, and was a representative of the institution. She said that it was crucial for each person to understand their position and to fulfill their responsibilities with professionalism and focus without allowing themselves to become distracted by aspirations that were beyond the scope of their qualifications. She did not mention Thomas by name, did not need to, but her meaning was unmistakable when she referenced a recent incident where she had discovered a member of the maintenance staff engaging in activities during work hours that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of their role. Victoria continued, her tone becoming almost philosophical, about how society functioned best when people knew their place, when they focused on excelling at what they were actually trained and hired to do, rather than indulging in fantasies about being something they were not. She said that there was dignity in all honest work, but that dignity required acknowledging reality, accepting one's station, and not pretending to talents or qualifications that one did not possess. Around the table, staff members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, some nodding in agreement, others staring intently at their laptops or notebooks. Sarah sat 3 seats down from Victoria, her face burning with shame on Thomas's behalf, her hands clenched in her lap beneath the table, but she remained silent. Victoria concluded by reminding everyone that the gala was their opportunity to showcase the Whitmore's standards and that she expected each person to focus entirely on their assigned duties, leaving their personal hobbies and delusions at home where they belonged. Friday evening arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that seemed designed for elegant gatherings. The air crisp and cool, and the city lights beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. The Whitmore Gallery glowed from within like a jewel box, every chandelier blazing, every surface polished to perfection, and by 7 o'clock the first guests were ascending the marble steps in their tailored tuxedos and designer gowns. They arrived in town cars and limousines, these collectors and critics and benefactors, their jewelry catching the light as they handed their invitations to the staff at the door and stepped into the warm embrace of culture and wealth. The gallery had been transformed for the occasion, with champagne stations positioned at strategic intervals and servers circulating with trays of delicacies that cost more per bite than most people spent on entire meals, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner of the main hall. Victoria moved through the crowd like royalty, resplendent in a black silk gown that hugged her figure and a diamond necklace that sparkled with each gesture, greeting important patrons by name and laughing at their jokes with perfect timing. She was in her element, commanding attention without demanding it. Her voice carrying just far enough to draw people into her orbit, and she spoke eloquently about the new installation and the gallery's vision and the importance of supporting transformative art. Critics from major publications stood in clusters, their expressions thoughtful and appraising, while collectors examined the displayed works with the calculating eyes of people who measured beauty in investment potential. Thomas worked through it all like a ghost, visible only when someone needed a fresh napkin or a spilled drink required attention. He wore the same maintenance uniform, though he had put on a clean one for the occasion, and he moved along the edges of the rooms with his trash bag and cleaning supplies, emptying waste bins and wiping down surfaces with the same quiet care he brought to his regular duties. The contrast was almost painful. The difference between Victoria in her diamonds holding court beneath million-dollar paintings and Thomas in his worn uniform collecting discarded champagne flutes from marble pedestals. She belonged to the light and conversation and clinking glasses, while he inhabited the shadows between, necessary but unnoticed, present but invisible. The incident occurred at 8:30, when the gala was in full swing, and the gallery hummed with conversation and the gentle clink of crystal. Thomas was working near the entrance to the contemporary wing, replacing a full waste bin with an empty liner, when an older gentleman in an impeccably tailored navy suit dropped his program while reaching for a glass of champagne from a passing server. The glossy booklet skittered across the polished floor and came to rest near Thomas's worn work boots. Thomas bent immediately to retrieve it, wiping it carefully with his sleeve to ensure no smudges marred the expensive paper, and he held it out to the gentleman with a slight nod. The man took it with genuine gratitude, thanking Thomas warmly and introducing himself as Richard Harrison, and there was something in his tone that suggested he was someone accustomed to treating all people with courtesy, regardless of their station. As Thomas turned to continue his work, his canvas bag shifted slightly on his shoulder, and the corner of his green sketchbook became visible, jutting out from the top where he had tucked it hastily before his shift. Mr. Harrison noticed it immediately, his eyes brightening with interest, and he asked kindly if Thomas was an artist. Thomas felt his face flush slightly, and he shook his head, adjusting the bag to hide the notebook, explaining that he just sketched a little during breaks. Nothing serious, just something he did to pass the time. Mr. Harrison smiled and said that art did not need to be serious to be meaningful, that some of the most honest work came from those who created simply for the love of it, and he seemed genuinely interested in hearing more. Thomas was about to respond, his guard lowering slightly in the face of such unexpected kindness, when Victoria's voice cut through the moment like a knife. She appeared beside them with the swift grace of someone who had been monitoring the room and had spotted a situation requiring her intervention. Her smile fixed and bright as she greeted Mr. Harrison by name, her hand touching his arm with practiced familiarity. Then her eyes slid to Thomas, and her smile changed, becoming something sharper, more amused, and she asked what they were discussing with a tone that suggested she already knew the answer and found it entertaining. Victoria's laugh rang out across the gallery space, clear and carrying, and several nearby conversations paused as heads turned toward the sound. She announced loudly enough for at least 20 people to hear that Mr. Harrison had discovered their resident artist, that Thomas here had quite the creative streak, sketching away during his breaks like a regular master. Her tone dripped with amusement, each word carefully chosen to make it clear that she was sharing a joke rather than stating a fact. Mr. Harrison's smile faltered, confusion crossing his face as he tried to understand the shift in atmosphere, but Victoria was already reaching for Thomas's bag, asking sweetly if she could see his work, if he would share his artistic vision with the assembled guests. Thomas stepped back slightly, his hand moving protectively toward the bag, but Victoria was faster and more insistent, and within moments she had extracted the green notebook and was flipping it open to the landscape sketch. She held it up like evidence in a trial, tilting it so that the cluster of guests now gathered around them could see, and she launched into what she called constructive criticism in a voice that was all patronizing kindness and barely concealed mockery. She pointed out that the perspective was slightly off, that the shading lacked sophistication, that it was the kind of competent but uninspired work one might expect from a community center class, perfectly adequate for a hobby, but hardly the product of genuine artistic vision. She said that Thomas, bless his heart, seemed to have confused the ability to copy what he saw with actual creative talent, that he apparently believed his little sketches qualified him as an artist rather than simply a janitor with delusions of grandeur. The gathered guests laughed, some nervously, others more freely. Caught up in Victoria's performance and uncertain whether disagreeing would mark them as lacking her sophisticated discernment, Victoria continued, suggesting with mock gentleness that Thomas should perhaps stick to what he did well, that his mops and buckets needed him far more than the art world did, and that there was no shame in knowing one's limitations. Thomas stood perfectly still throughout the ordeal, his face pale but composed, his hands at his sides, and though he said nothing, the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable to anyone who cared to look. Across the room, Sarah Chen stood frozen near a marble column, her hand pressed to her mouth, horrified by what she was witnessing but paralyzed by her own fear and powerlessness to intervene. The silence that followed Victoria's performance stretched for several long seconds, heavy and uncomfortable. And then Thomas spoke. His voice was quiet but steady, carrying a dignity that no amount of humiliation could strip away. And he said simply that he believed art was for everyone, not just for those who made their living from it or those who could afford to buy it. He said that he drew because it brought him peace, because it helped him see the world more clearly, and that he had never claimed to be anything more than someone who found joy in the act of creation. He met Victoria's eyes as he spoke, his gaze calm and direct. And for a moment, something flickered across her face, something that might have been discomfort or even shame, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Victoria recovered immediately, her smile returning as she patted Thomas on the shoulder with exaggerated affection, the kind of gesture one might offer a confused child, and she declared that his sentiment was absolutely precious, really quite sweet. She told the assembled guests that this was exactly what she had been talking about at the staff meeting, this inability to distinguish between personal enjoyment and professional qualification, between therapeutic doodling and serious artistic practice. She said that, of course, everyone should have hobbies, that creative expression was wonderful for mental health and stress relief, but that these pursuits existed in an entirely different universe from the work that hung on these walls, from the art that changed culture and commanded respect. She handed the notebook back to Thomas with a patronizing smile, suggesting that he keep pursuing his little hobby if it made him happy. And then she turned back to Mr. Harrison and the other guests, effortlessly redirecting the conversation to the new installation and away from the uncomfortable scene she had created. Thomas carefully placed his notebook back in his bag, his movements slow and deliberate, and he returned to his work, pushing his cart toward the next waste bin that needed emptying. But something had changed in his expression, a subtle shift that was visible only to those who were truly watching. The quiet acceptance in his eyes had been replaced by something else, something harder and more resolved, as though a decision had been made in the depths of his mind. Sarah, still watching from across the room, saw it and felt a chill run down her spine. The commotion at the entrance occurred at 9:15, when most of the guests had already arrived and settled into the rhythm of the evening. The heavy brass doors opened and a woman entered, flanked by two younger assistants who helped remove her elegant wrap, and an immediate ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Margaret Wells was 78 years old and carried herself with the kind of absolute authority that came from 5 decades of shaping the art world according to her vision. She had served on the boards of 7 major museums, had amassed one of the most significant private collections in the country, and her endorsement or criticism could determine whether an artist's work hung in history books or disappeared into obscurity. She wore a deep burgundy gown that spoke of timeless elegance rather than trendy fashion, and her white hair was swept up in a style that emphasized her sharp, intelligent features. The moment Victoria spotted her, everything changed. She excused herself from her conversation mid-sentence, her entire demeanor shifting from confident host to eager supplicant. And she moved across the gallery floor with quick, purposeful steps, her professional smile transforming into something brighter and more obsequious. Victoria reached Margaret with breathless enthusiasm, greeting her with effusive warmth and apologizing that they had not known she would be attending, assuring her that they would have prepared a proper welcome. Margaret accepted Victoria's greeting with polite coolness, her handshake brief and perfunctory, and her eyes were already scanning the gallery space even as Victoria spoke. She seemed distracted, uninterested in Victoria's nervous chatter about the new installation and the distinguished guest list, her gaze moving methodically across the room as though searching for something or someone specific. Victoria continued talking, following Margaret's line of sight with increasing confusion, asking if there was something in particular she wished to see, offering to provide a private tour or to introduce her to specific collectors. Margaret made a non-committal sound, barely listening, her attention focused entirely on her search. Then her eyes found what they were looking for, and her entire face transformed, years seeming to fall away as genuine delight replaced her distracted expression. She was looking toward the far corner of the gallery, where Thomas stood beside his cleaning cart, carefully wiping down a glass display case. Margaret moved forward without warning, leaving Victoria standing with her mouth half open mid-sentence, her carefully prepared comments about the installation hanging unfinished in the air. The legendary collector walked directly across the gallery floor with surprising speed for her age, her burgundy gown flowing behind her, and she seemed utterly oblivious to the confused stares that followed her path. Victoria stood frozen for a moment, shock and irritation warring on her face, before she hurried after Margaret, trying to understand what had captured the woman's attention so completely. Margaret reached Thomas just as he was folding his cleaning cloth and preparing to move to the next display case, and she said his name with such warmth and familiarity that several nearby guests turned to watch. She called him Thomas, not Mr. Reed or Sir, just Thomas, as though they were old friends reuniting after too long apart, and her smile was genuine and unguarded, in a way that made it clear this was not a collector addressing hired help, but something else entirely. Thomas looked up at her voice, and his expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, surprise and pleasure and something that might have been resignation. Before settling into a quiet smile, he greeted her softly, acknowledging her presence with a respect that seemed rooted in genuine affection rather than deference to status. Margaret reached out and took both his hands in hers, a gesture of real warmth. And she told him that she had been hoping to find him here, that they needed to talk. She asked if there was somewhere private they could speak, somewhere away from all these people and noise. Victoria arrived at Margaret's elbow, slightly breathless and thoroughly confused, and she interjected with a strained laugh that perhaps there had been some mistake, that this was Thomas, one of their maintenance staff, and surely Margaret had mistaken him for someone else. Margaret turned to look at Victoria with an expression of mild surprise, as though she had forgotten the director existed, and she said quite clearly that there was no mistake, that she knew exactly who Thomas was, and that she needed to speak with him privately about a matter of considerable importance. Victoria's professional smile was beginning to crack at the edges, her irritation at being dismissed and ignored breaking through her careful composure. Margaret did not lower her voice or move toward privacy. Instead, she turned back to Thomas and asked, loudly enough that her words carried across the suddenly quieting gallery, whether he had reconsidered her offer to exhibit his new collection at the Metropolitan Museum's contemporary wing. She said that the board had been waiting for his answer for 6 months now, and that they were prepared to dedicate an entire floor to his work if he would only agree. She mentioned specific paintings by name, her voice clear and certain, speaking of autumn's last light, and the river at dawn, and winter silence, each title dropping into the hushed space like a stone into still water. These were not obscure works. These were paintings that had appeared in every major art publication over the past 3 decades. Pieces that had sold at auction for staggering sums, works that critics analyzed in scholarly journals and students studied in art history courses. The room fell completely silent, conversations dying mid-word as guests turned to stare, champagne flutes frozen halfway to lips, eyes wide with confusion and dawning realization. Victoria's confident expression began to crack like fine porcelain under pressure, her smile fading as her brow furrowed, and she looked between Margaret and Thomas with growing bewilderment. She interrupted with a forced laugh that sounded brittle and uncertain, asking what was happening, saying that surely there had been some confusion, that Margaret must be thinking of someone else because this was just Thomas, their janitor. Margaret turned to Victoria with an expression of genuine puzzlement. Her eyebrows raised, and she asked slowly whether Victoria did not know who Thomas was, whether the gallery director was truly unaware that she had one of the most important living artists working in her building. Victoria stammered something about maintenance staff and job applications, her voice rising slightly, the polish of her professional demeanor beginning to flake away as panic edged into her tone. Around them, guests were whispering urgently to one another, pulling out phones to search for information. The energy in the room shifting from elegant sophistication to barely contained shock. Sarah Chen stood near the back of the growing crowd, her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes wide with amazement as the pieces suddenly clicked into place in her mind. Margaret stared at Victoria with something approaching disbelief, and then she turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. She asked if no one in this prestigious gallery recognized Thomas J. Reed, the reclusive genius whose work had defined contemporary landscape painting for the past 30 years, whose canvases hung in the most important museums across the world, whose identity had been one of the art world's most closely guarded secrets. She explained that Thomas had built his entire career on anonymity, working through a single dealer who had honored his wishes for privacy, never appearing at exhibitions or granting interviews, creating art purely for the sake of creation rather than fame. His paintings sold for millions at auction, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she warmed to her subject, and collectors waited years for the chance to acquire even a small piece, while critics wrote dissertations analyzing his unique approach to light and atmosphere. Margaret turned back to Thomas, her expression softening, and she revealed that he had told her years ago about his decision to work ordinary jobs, to stay close to art without being consumed by the machinery of the art market, to remain grounded in the simple act of seeing and creating. She said that he had worked as a janitor at 3 different galleries over the decades, that he found peace in the quiet hours spent alone with great art, that this life allowed him to create without the pressure of expectation or the corruption of celebrity. The room erupted in shocked whispers, voices rising and falling like waves as guests turned to their neighbors in disbelief, phones appearing as people frantically searched for images of Thomas J. Reed's legendary works. Victoria stood perfectly still, her face drained of all color, her mouth opening and closing without sound as the full magnitude of what she had done crashed over her like a tidal wave. She had mocked him, humiliated him publicly, dismissed his work as the delusions of a hobby artist, all while standing in a gallery that would have paid any price to exhibit even one of his pieces. Victoria's face went from pale to ashen, the blood draining so completely that even her carefully applied makeup could not hide the transformation. Her hands trembled slightly as she raised them in a gesture that was half denial and half supplication, and she began to speak in a voice that had lost all its earlier confidence and authority. She stammered that she had not known, that there had been no indication, that surely Thomas could understand the confusion given his position and his appearance. She turned to Thomas with desperate eyes and began offering apologies that tumbled over each other in their haste, saying that she had made a terrible mistake, that his work was obviously extraordinary, that she had been joking earlier, and he must have known she was not serious. She called his sketch brilliant, claimed she had actually been impressed but had expressed it poorly, insisted that she had always sensed something special about him. Thomas stood quietly through this performance, his expression calm and unreadable, offering neither acceptance nor rejection of her frantic words, simply existing in the center of the storm with the same dignity he had maintained throughout his humiliation. Margaret watched Victoria's collapse with cold eyes, and when the director finally ran out of words and stood breathing heavily with desperation written across her face, Margaret spoke. Her voice cut through the whispers and murmurs like a blade, clear and sharp and filled with disappointment. She said that she was deeply troubled by what she had witnessed this evening, that Victoria's behavior revealed a fundamental failure of judgment and character that called into question her qualifications to run an institution dedicated to art. She noted that true appreciation of art required the ability to see beyond surface appearances, to recognize value regardless of how it was packaged, and that anyone who could spend months working alongside greatness without recognizing it had no business curating or evaluating artistic merit. Margaret continued, her words measured and devastating, that the art world had no place for people who judged by clothing and job titles rather than by vision and talent, who confused wealth with worth and polish with profundity. Around them, the assembled guests stood in uncomfortable silence, witnesses to a professional execution carried out with surgical precision. Mr. Harrison stepped forward from where he had been standing at the edge of the crowd, and his voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard. He said that he was deeply disappointed by what he had witnessed. That as the Whitmore Gallery's largest private benefactor, he had trusted the institution to embody the values of respect and genuine appreciation for art in all its forms. He noted that Victoria's behavior toward Thomas had been not merely unprofessional, but cruel, and that her inability to recognize extraordinary talent revealed a superficiality that was antithetical to everything a gallery should represent. Other voices joined his. Patrons and critics who had watched the scene unfold and now felt emboldened to express their own discomfort and disapproval. A prominent art critic from a major publication spoke up, saying she had been disturbed by Victoria's mocking tone and dismissive attitude, that such behavior suggested a troubling elitism that prioritized appearance over substance. Another collector mentioned that he had overheard Victoria making similar disparaging comments earlier in the evening, that this did not seem to be an isolated incident but rather a pattern of behavior. Then Sarah Chen moved forward, her face flushed but her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. She said quietly that she had witnessed Victoria humiliating Thomas on multiple occasions over the past week, that the director had made him the subject of jokes in front of staff and had used him as an example in a meeting about knowing one's place. She described the staff meeting in detail, Victoria's comments about people staying within their stations and not indulging in aspirations beyond their qualifications, and the room seemed to grow colder with each word. Victoria tried to interrupt, to explain or defend herself, but Sarah continued speaking, her voice growing stronger as she recounted what she had seen. Around the room, 3 people in elegant evening wear exchanged glances, and one of them, a silver-haired woman in emerald green, announced that as members of the Whitmore Gallery's board of directors, they would need to convene an immediate private meeting to discuss what they had witnessed this evening. Victoria's face crumbled completely, tears beginning to form in her eyes as she realized that her carefully constructed professional reputation was disintegrating in real time before an audience of the most influential people in the art world. Thomas raised his hand slightly, a small gesture that nonetheless commanded immediate attention, and the crowd fell silent as he prepared to speak. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying across the gallery with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. He said that he appreciated everyone's support, but that he wanted to address what had happened not as a personal grievance but as an opportunity to examine something larger. He spoke about how society had trained people to judge worth by occupation and appearance, to assume that a janitor could not be an artist, that someone in worn work boots could not possess genius, that value could be determined by the surface rather than the substance beneath. He said that he had chosen this life deliberately, that he had walked away from fame and recognition 30 years ago because he had watched the art world consume too many talented people, turning creation into commodity and artists into performers. He explained that working as a janitor had kept him humble and honest, had reminded him daily that all work had dignity, and that the act of cleaning galleries had allowed him to spend his evenings in the presence of beauty without the burden of ego or expectation. Thomas turned to look at Victoria, and his expression held no anger, only a kind of sad understanding. He said that her behavior was not simply a personal failing, but a reflection of a systemic problem in the art world, a culture that had forgotten that art was supposed to be about truth and vision rather than status and spectacle. He noted that galleries and museums had become temples to wealth rather than creativity, that curators often valued provenance over passion, and that the industry had created hierarchies that separated the worthy from the unworthy based on all the wrong criteria. He suggested that perhaps this moment could serve as a reminder that genuine appreciation required humility, that recognizing beauty demanded the ability to see beyond assumptions, and that the art world needed to remember that talent could exist anywhere, in anyone, regardless of how they dressed or what job paid their bills. 6 months had passed since that evening at the Whitmore Gallery, and the spring sunshine streamed through the large windows of the Riverside Community Arts Center, illuminating walls covered with artwork created by children and teenagers from the surrounding neighborhoods. Victoria Ashford stood in front of a group of 15 young students, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a paint-stained cotton shirt, and her face held an openness that had not been there before. She was teaching a class on landscape painting, speaking encouragingly to a shy girl who worried that her trees did not look realistic enough, telling her that art was about expressing what she saw and felt, not about perfection. The transformation in Victoria was profound, visible not just in her clothing or her setting, but in the way she moved and spoke. The defensive arrogance replaced by something quieter and more genuine. She had resigned from the Whitmore Gallery the week after the gala, before the board could officially terminate her. And after 2 months of reflection and therapy, she had applied for this position, teaching art to underprivileged youth. When Thomas entered the center that afternoon with Margaret Wells at his side, Victoria looked up from her class and felt her heart constrict with a mixture of shame and hope. She excused herself and approached them slowly, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She told Thomas that she was glad to see him, that she had hoped for this chance, and then she apologized with a sincerity that came from months of genuine reflection and growth. She said that she had been cruel and blind, that she had let her ego and insecurity turn her into someone she was ashamed to remember, and that working here had taught her what she should have known all along, that talent and worth had nothing to do with status or appearance. Thomas listened quietly, and then he accepted her apology with the same grace he had shown throughout, telling her that growth required humility and that she was doing important work. Margaret explained that they had come to donate 3 of Thomas's paintings for the center's fundraiser, pieces that would raise enough money to fund programs for 2 years. Meanwhile, at the Whitmore Gallery, Sarah Chen sat in her new office with the title of assistant director on her door, overseeing the implementation of new policies requiring respect training for all staff and creating mentorship programs that valued every employee regardless of their role. Thomas returned to his simple apartment that evening after visiting the community center, climbing the 3 flights of stairs to his door and letting himself into the familiar space with its single window and narrow bed. He made himself a cup of tea, sat at his small table, and opened his current sketchbook, beginning a new drawing of the view from the center's windows and the way the afternoon light had illuminated the children's eager faces as they worked on their paintings. He had turned down Margaret's exhibition offer once again, explaining gently that he was content with his life as it was, that he had no need for retrospectives or recognition, that the act of creation itself was enough. The money from his paintings continued to flow through his anonymous dealer, and he donated most of it to programs like the community center, finding more satisfaction in enabling others to create than in celebrating his own work. The incident at the Whitmore Gallery had sent ripples through the art world, sparking conversations about elitism and accessibility, about who was allowed to call themselves an artist and who decided such things. The gallery itself had undergone a cultural transformation under Sarah's influence, implementing policies that valued every employee and created pathways for staff to share their own creative work. Victoria's journey had been perhaps the most dramatic, moving from a place of arrogance and cruelty to one of genuine service and humility, learning that teaching children to see beauty was more meaningful than curating it for the wealthy. The story of the janitor who was a genius had become a parable in art circles, a reminder that talent did not announce itself with expensive clothes or impressive titles. What happened that night at the Whitmore Gallery teaches us something essential about human nature and the judgments we make every single day. How often do we look at someone and decide their worth based on their occupation, their clothing, the surface presentation they offer to the world? How many times have we dismissed someone's dreams or talents because they did not fit our narrow definition of who gets to be creative, who gets to matter, who deserves our respect? True art exists everywhere, in the hands of janitors and teachers and people working jobs that society deems ordinary, and genius does not require recognition or wealth to be real. The lesson here is clear and urgent. Treat every person you encounter with dignity and respect, because you never know who they might be or what gifts they carry. Judge people by their character and their kindness, not by their status or appearance. Remember that humility and compassion matter infinitely more than titles or acclaim. The next time you meet someone whose circumstances seem humble, pause before you judge, because greatness often walks quietly among us, asking only to be seen.